you should watch some Spanish language thrillers. Why Spanish? Why not? Spain, Mexico, and Argentina, I think especially, have, maybe an overlooked cinematic history, at least compared to some other, notable countries in the cinematic canon. Why thrillers? I just like thrillers. That's what I've been watching lately. This will be mostly modern films, because again, that's what I've been watching lately. But before we jump to the modern stuff, I will recommend two older films from the 50s. The first is going to be the Spanish film Death of a Cyclist. This is directed by Juan Antonio Bardem, who is notably the uncle of Javier Bardem. It deals with a couple having an affair. They hit and kill a bicyclist with their car and try to cover it up. There's great direction in the film, and the technical elements give it a great boost. It has some wonderful composition and use of distance, use of lighting for one climactic driving scene. The ending's awesome. Maybe my favorite match cut I've ever seen in a film. Casting matters quite a bit in the film, and I think it uses the similarity of the two male characters, the two main male characters, as a great thematic point. And then I'll also throw in Argentina's If I Should Die Before I Wake. Love that title. And it's about a young boy who accidentally discovers the identity of a killer operating in his town. I'm not as high on this one, because Death of a Cyclist is maybe my favorite Spanish language film I've watched. But this does have some beautiful visual accents. The way it handles some of the kidnappings and the lead up to the film's climax, really great poetic stuff. And the film itself has some interesting commentary on masculinity and adolescence. It's also got this kind of like fairy tale scaffolding in the intro that I really like quite a bit. So from here, I'll pivot to some directors. The obvious recommendations, of course, like Cuarón and Del Toro and Iñárritu and Almodóvar, although he doesn't usually do thrillers, but whatever. Those are kind of the most common Spanish language directors that you might come across. Definitely watch them, but they don't need any advocacy from me. They're well known enough. So I'll try to do some lesser known ones. First, I'll do the most well-known of these recommendations, which is going to be Spanish director Alejandro Amenábar. He's got a limited filmography, only like 5 or 6 features, I think, but 3 thrillers. Most well-known for The Others, which is in the running for probably the best PG-13 horror movie. He also directed 2 others, Thesis and Open Your Eyes. You may recognize Open Your Eyes as the source material for Vanilla Sky, a Tom Cruise vehicle, but as always, the original is better. To me, his most interesting film is Thesis, in which Angela finds a snuff film which leads her on a search for the victim in the film, a former student at her college. It's a cat and mouse type of film. It's investigation, mystery, maybe a little bit horror-ish given the snuff film. It's a film partially about film and partially about violence, mostly about violence. It concerns the fascination that the average person has with violence, and as well as the stigma against it. It concerns cinema's responsibility, the responsibility of artists towards their audience, whether they ought to do what the audience calls for, whether they ought to kind of challenge them or try to better them in a certain sense. Those 2 things are kind of in dialogue throughout the film and posing ideas, and we're kind of examining those through Angela's life as someone who is fascinated with violence, someone who might be on the fringes of society if her fascinations were to be well known. Also has some great music in addition to the interesting ideas and execution. Highly recommend this one. Second, I've got a huge soft spot for complicated, elaborate, but also lower budget sci-fi. To me, I love the convoluted, complicated, twisty sorts of sci-fi movies that are like, kind of like B-plus movies sometimes. One director I want to highlight here is the Spanish director Orio Paulo, with films like The Invisible Guest, Durante la Tormenta, and El Cuerpo. These films are kind of difficult to talk about too much given their nature, right? The fact they try to keep you guessing, they throw a lot at you, keep you off balance, stuff like that. So I don't want to give out too many details or really many details on any of them. They're fun rides. They're fun to follow along with. I think The Invisible Guest is the best of the 3. I think it follows the idea through the whole film really well. Durante la Tormenta has a great setup that I don't really think it follows up with that well, but it's still worth checking out. El Cuerpo is solid throughout. Like, I try not to hold, believability against movies, but I'll say at some points El Cuerpo does kind of test me on that a little bit. Nonetheless, enjoy all 3 of them quite a bit. And then another director I want to mention real briefly is the Mexican director Isaac Ezban, specifically for his film The Similars. This is a fun throwback to kind of like Twilight Zone, old school sci-fi. It hits the balance pretty well between being like a little bit goofy and over the top, having kind of like a big over the top plot device, but also it's not an accident. I think it's clear the film understands what its material is, that it's a little bit pulpy. It's also got a lot on its mind politically, I believe. Of course, not familiar intimately with Mexico's politics or their history, but it does remind me a little bit from a U.S. perspective of something like McCarthyism, or perhaps some kind of, generational political divide. It's interesting to try and nail down. It's a fun commentary, I think, and a great watch. Then the third is going to be my favorite of these directors. It's Spanish director Rodrigo Sorogoyen. man. He's got a limited filmography as well. I'll focus on The Beasts, The Realm, and May God Save Us. As a director, I think he's got a great feel for dynamics. He likes the handheld camera quite a bit. It's featured prominently in, especially May God Save Us and The Realm. Many of his films have good tension added with that operation. But at the same time, and I think this is one of the more impressive things, he is able to draw great amount of tension, not just from the extra kind of like visual distortion of a handheld camera, but also he can use stillness and quietness so effectively. The Realm, for instance, I think this is a great example of his dynamic control. It's blisteringly paced. It's so fast. We are dealing with like this emerging sort of political crisis within the party. A lot of bad things happening, a lot of information being thrown around, walking and talking, trying to organize party members, things like that. First two acts are full of anxiety, worrying events and stuff like that. But despite that, to me, the two most powerful moments of tension are moments of stillness or relative quietness compared to the hustle and bustle of the first two acts and even the beginning of Act 3. So to me, that diversity and the control in both extremes of kind of like your perceived intensity is a great mark in his favor. And also part of the recommendation for The Realm has one of the best Act 3s I've ever seen. It's just phenomenal. Also, Antonio de la Torre is fantastic as the lead. Love him in every movie he's done, every movie I've seen of him. He also loves his long takes. He uses them in some capacity in each of these films, definitely in the first two. The Beasts, I think, has the best usage, the best example of a different type of dynamic control to me. He uses one long take with a pretty stable camera, which is kind of like framing a conversation between two people with a third person. It's static. They're just talking back and forth. We're just kind of waiting on pins and needles for the conversation to play out for a conclusion, for our next steps, basically, in the film. And it is very simple, again, very quiet, still exudes tension because of, the context of the rest of the film. And then another one, the other long shot in the film, I think the one I just mentioned is 10 minutes. The one I'm about to talk about is like 8, if I remember right. The second one is complete opposite. It is full of movement. It is very emotively shot and blocked. And it's kind of using that cinematography and blocking as the editing, in a sense, kind of giving the scene the same sort of life that cuts and changes between close-ups and changes in positioning and stuff would normally have. But it's just one long scene and you get to watch the conversation play out in real time. Love his stuff. Highly recommend all 3 of those films. And I'm eagerly awaiting whatever he does next. And then very last, the movie that's made me cry harder than I think anything else I've ever cried to is Tigers Are Not Afraid by Mexican director Issa Lopez. Very Del Toro inspired in my mind. It's about a group of children essentially navigating the landscape of cartel wars. It has that Del Toro touch of primarily human drama with supernatural backing. It's got a fantastical fairy tale-like quality to it, something that, might remind you of Pan's Labyrinth or The Devil's Backbone. And I think perhaps the most impressive part, honestly, is the fact that this is a movie centered around children with a majority of the screen time featuring at least some of these children. They're not a negative. They're perfectly fine in the film. They're not distracting. That is extremely impressive to me. It is hard to get good performances out of child actors. It's probably not hard to imagine how a film like this, right, centered around children basically interacting with the cartel wars would pull at your heartstrings. But I think to me the punchiest moment is not like a misery porn or anything like that. It's a beautiful film. It doesn't crush you. It shows you a sad and depressing reality, but it didn't leave me depressed, sort of. It's beautiful movie. Highly recommend it. There are, of course, many worthwhile Spanish language films from other countries as well, not just these 3. But some of my favorites, maybe I'll leave some in reserve for like a Hidden Gems movie or something like that. But check them out. Watch the movies in other languages. It's great. Subtitles aren't that bad.